Well, I want to thank you all for joining us today for our exhibition, Letendre in studio. As Barry Callaghan, Ray Ellenwood, both of them very helpful for Canadian art and biggest sport of Canadian culture and art. Both of them done very well. And then I'm so pleased to be here, to able to come in and have a talk about the Rita life and her work. Barry Callaghan and Ray Ellenwood.
That's the most hesitant, welcoming clap I've heard. What can I tell you? You're here.
Exactly.
I can assure you, you're here. I have to ask you a question before we even start. I see a folder that you have that says William Ronald on it.
I'll show you after.
Don't tell me now, because I once tried to introduce Bill to Casso and Rita, and they had absolutely nothing to say to each other. Nothing.
No, he spoke to them. He knew them.
Yeah.
Well,
Are you a friend of Bill's?
Helen.
Hmm?
I'm a friend of Helen.
You're a friend of Helen's?
Yeah, I'll talk to you after.
Yeah, okay, good.
Well, one other thing that I would like to mention, Barry Callaghan published this quarterly magazine, absolutely fantastic. As he financed them, he put a lot of energy, he financed a lot of good writers. Ray Ellenwood, his write-up about the Letendre, and the rest of them is I would like to have a copy, and I would like to purchase the book, and then also you can get them every year 4 times. You don't bore the wonderful thing to write up. So, Excel.
But
Yes,
are you selling
there
some?
are exiles over there, and I would expect that those of you who have $1 in your pocket will buy one in support of what we do.
And then he takes the donation too.
And yes, we're in a funding situation. Those of you who have any loose change of sizable proportion. We just had a big fundraiser, and we're in the business of fundraising to keep going. But that's not why we're here. We're here to talk about Rita and Casso, and which we don't know what we're going to do. So this is right off the cuff. And I just said to Ray, I should explain that Ray and I have known each other for a long time. Since the 70s?
72.
72. And we've had a very amiable relationship through all of those years, though in some fundamental ways we are temperamentally, we don't agree about certain things, and our disagreements tend to amuse us, at least they amuse me anyway. And I hope to be amusing in my old age. So we've been together through thick and thin through a lot of things, particularly at York University. But this may be the first time we've ever talked together this way. Is that right? Do you think?
It may be. I forget.
Well, I forgot my hearing aid, so there we go. I think it is. It's rather astonishing that we could have known each other for 50 years and more. Have public press. Anyway, the way I thought we might start is I might tell you that I played a role in why Casso and Rita actually lived in Toronto. And it was in the 60s. And at that time, I was a young professor. I'd probably been at York University maybe 2 years. And in 1966, I had taken the position as literary editor of the Toronto Telegram, which was pretty bizarre because it was the Tory, right-wing Tory newspaper in town. It was known as the Pink Telly because the front page actually was printed pink. But there I was in the middle of it, running these. John Bassett ended up giving me 3 full folio pages of book reviews. It was extraordinary, an extraordinary time. So I wrote about everything. And one of the things I did is I wrote about international writing a lot, which meant that when I ran into a guy named Kosso Elul, probably in '68, maybe, something like that, I discovered that he had, one of the things that he had begun to do in the city, trying to live here, was he was reading my book pages, and so he wanted to talk, and I discovered that he was deeply immersed in what was going on in Europe, and so we could talk about Russian poetry, and we could talk about all kinds of matters that were of concern to us, and he introduced me to Rita. I didn't know her before that, and I was just immediately, as anybody would be, struck by her. She was, it's not that she was beautiful, there was something beyond beauty about Rita. There was a power that emanated out of her and kind of joy that just, the very fact of her own existence energized her. But what I discovered immediately from Kosso is that he wanted out of town. He could not stand this place. Why? To put it in simple terms, he couldn't get to know anybody. The phrase he used, there's no cafes. I can't go to a cafe and meet any painters. I can't meet any writers. I can't meet any, where the fuck is everybody? And I said, it's very simple. This is what I call a living room town. The cultural life takes place behind the drapes in the living room and in the kitchens. And hang in for a while, and I'll introduce you to a couple of living rooms, and we'll see how it goes. So he hung in, and of course, he was enormously charming as a presence, and he immediately developed relationships. When I say charming as a presence, you have to remember that that was a period in which one of the most popular films was called Zorba, Zorba the Greek. And people in Toronto, in their own provincial way, they identified Kosso by his looks and his energy, those deep crevices in his face and the big mustache, and his Russian presence as Zorba. He didn't deliberately play Zorba, but he played that role of having energy and engagement and love of life. And as his sidekick, he had this woman who just obviously loved the very fact of existence. It was, I hesitate to use the word primal, but it was energy. So he stayed here. And they ended up living on Beloyal Street. Now that became a very special street in that time, the 60s. And I don't know what people know about that now, but that's the world of Jewish developers, particularly a guy named Al Green. He built all those apartment houses along Beloyal, and Rita, the next thing we knew is that Rita and Kosso had a penthouse apartment on one of them there, and the deal was that he would do a sculpture and he would pay, in effect, the rent by giving Al Green a sculpture. And so you go up on the Beloyal, you'll find there are 1 or 2 Kosso pieces up there, and Kosso managed to finance their way into and through Toronto in the early days by doing deals like that, particularly with developers, and particularly Jewish developers who were enamored of him because he was an Israeli. And it was a very big deal to be an Israeli then, particularly among Jews in Toronto and Jews in Montreal. More Toronto for Kosso than in Montreal. There is an irony about that, which I think, if someone here is a kind of research person who's interested in aspects of cultural life of the city, is that when Kosso moved into Toronto, bringing Rita with him, and he moved into the world of the developers, and a very high-powered and influential group of Jewish supporters business people who were supporters of the arts community, there was another artist here, another sculptor here, and that was Sorel Letendre. And as I remember, Sorel Letendre was down the other end of the Belle-Isle apartments, and he had his own penthouse. So one would naturally ask, did they get along? And the answer, of course, was no, they didn't get along. Now, their support was different. This is why this could be an interesting story for someone to look into. Casso had to make his way with, see, you have to understand, Casso was at the mercy of people, of builders who would support the construction of his sculptures to be placed on the sites of these apartment buildings as they went up, and other kinds of buildings too, but mainly apartment buildings then. Sorel's situation was quite different. I knew Sorel. I didn't know him as well then as I came to know him, but I knew Sorel, and his relationship was very personal. His relationship was with a family called the Zacks, Sam Zacks and Ayala Zacks. I think it was Ayala's second marriage. And she was very interested in art and a great benefactor. And the day that Sorel arrived in Toronto, they took him up. They became his supporters. So they were almost his Medici family. So Sorel was not out on the street trying to hustle, whereas Casso was hustling all the time. Hustle, hustle, hustle. Every second week he would have a supper at the penthouse apartment in which a developer or two would be the guest, and he would ask me to come. I came along as the kind of, quote, intellectual wait for the supper. You know, I provided a little variety, talk about this and that, and this, and that was surprising that I would be there. At least that's what he thought. So anyway, so I played the game, showed up, but it was all part of something that Casso had to do all his life while he was in town here. He had to work to get those pieces supported. As a matter of fact, when he had his first big show, I told you the name of the gallery the other day. It was a Toronto Jewish man who'd fought in the 48 war, I think, in big, what's it?
Gentlemen.
Dunkelman, exactly.
I was around then too.
Eh?
I was around then too.
Right.
My name is Gail Dexter.
It was at Prince Arthur and
Yeah, right.
Bedford,
Yeah,
right.
that's correct.
So he offered Casso a show, but he told Casso he had to have a major piece. And in those days, I was working at the Telegram, I was working at university, and I started working in television, so I had a little loose change, and we were very close by then. I said, well, okay, I'll put up the money for a piece. I put up $3,000, which was a lot of money in those days. And he produced a big piece. It was maybe 7 or 8 feet. It was 2 pieces like this, which he called Cobar, Casso and Barry. And that was the centerpiece in his show at the Dunkelman. And I got to keep the piece because I paid for it. But that satisfied Dunkelman. But that was, I tell you, that only to say that he was on a hustle like that all the time, trying to find money to keep going, because the thing with Al Green would eventually run out. But he did well enough at a time it ran out with Al Green that he was able to, and Rita had begun to do well, he was able to invest in a house that you probably all came to know on Sherbrooke Street. And so he really settled into a comfortable state of being. Now, I'll say something quickly about Rita, and then you're going to talk about California, right?
Well, I was thinking earlier than that.
Okay, no, so I'll just say a few things about Rita then. Casso and I, my bond initially was with Casso. Because Casso, I remember I wrote a review of a Holocaust novelist named Yaakov Lind. And as it turned out, he knew Yaakov Lind. And so he liked this review so much that he sent it somewhere in Europe to Lind to say, you gotta read this. So he was in touch with that kind of intellectual, literary, ideational world. Rita wasn't interested in that stuff at all. Rita just wanted to paint. And when I met Rita, she was kind of halfway into what you now think of as her style, before she discovered the spray gun. I prefer before the spray gun, but the spray gun became a weapon of choice of hers. When we talked about painting, a couple of things, and art, a couple of things became clear. If Picasso had an influence, I would locate it in the world of, say, the Argentinian and Italian painter, sculptor Fontana. And he actually, if you know Picasso's work, he did some flat pieces in steel and paper where he slipped them like this. You can find that all through Fontana. I mean, he was just borrowing Fontana there. But he was, the ideational world or conceptual world of sculpture is what he was into. He was not interested in figurative drawing. Not surprisingly, Picasso couldn't draw to save his life. And frankly, Rita wasn't so good either. But Picasso was so aware, there are ironies in this kind of thing, if you're discussing with people. He was so aware of drawing and the power of drawing that he used to keep on his work desk a drawing of a hand that Rita had done. And it was a hand like a club. You know, I have to say that it might have been her own hand because she had the hands of a boxer. She could be a little frightening if she closed her fist, because she could get angry and close those fists, boy. Anyway, it was a pretty good drawing. It was not a great drawing, but he talked about it as a great drawing because Picasso simply adored her and was totally overwhelmed by her energy and her talent and his belief. Now, the biggest influence in Rita's life was Picasso. All you have to do is look at Picasso's sculpture and his conceptual concerns, and you see how she took it into her painting and refined her way out of, if refined is the right word, refined her way out of the expressionism that we associate with the Automatistes. So Picasso and Rita had this bond around how she was developing her painting, and you've all seen this. There's a big painting as big as that one there, but wider, of her in the oil penthouse. She's standing in front of it. I was there the day that she finished it, and it was like for Picasso, it was like he was in the presence of Homer having just finished, his greatest work. Yeah, he was so proud, so excited, and she was sure that it was great. Those two people, they were after greatness, and they believed that they were in touch with it. Right? When we came to talk about other artists, it grew rather limited, and this influenced their social life. Because I was just saying that I tried to introduce them to William Ronald, for example. It went nowhere. They had nothing to say to Bill. But as a person, Rita particularly had nothing to say to him as a person. Although I thought she should have, and they had nothing to say about his work. Now, the woman that I lived with is an artist who had an exhibition here recently, Claire Wilkes, and she was a figurative artist. And the most important influence in her early life was Kachakovitz. Both Rita and Picasso had not a good word to say for Kachakovitz, not a word. To them, it was simply figurative propaganda. The fact that Picasso was so enamored of this hand that Rita had done, and that Kollwitz did magnificent hands. There was no irony in that for him at all. They just would not talk about Kachakovitz, which meant that relationships, we had a really kind of tight social relationship, but that meant we never talked about Claire's work, ever. And Claire was just burgeoning then, and just beginning, that's true, and to realize her own style. But we just never talked about it because they wouldn't talk about figurative work. And I'll come back to this later, but the idea that she had any interest in Aboriginal or indigenous painting is crazy. She simply did not. Period. Point. In any conversation, now she may have secretly buried it in her heart, I don't know. But in any conversation that I had with her, zip, zero. The two men, the two artists personally that influenced her were Ulysses Comtois, the first big man in her life, and Picasso, the second big man in her life. They were not anywhere close to that world. They weren't close to anything that was figurative. They didn't want to talk about it. So enough of me for now. Now, Ray.
So,
Very,
I can't talk so personally about Rita and Picasso as Barry can. I got to know Rita later in her life. The first time I met her was shortly after Exile Editions published my book on the Automatiste movement. This would be in 1994, right? Somewhere around there. So I was invited to give a talk at Glendon College in the big manoir at Glendon College on the Automatiste movement on a bitter, cold winter night. And among the 5 people in the audience was an elderly couple in the back of the room. And after my slightly discouraged talk, they came up and introduced themselves as Rita and Picasso. Now, I had talked about them with Barry, but I never met them before. But I was touched by the fact that they had come out to hear me talk about the Automatiste group. And of course, that would be entirely Rita's doing. I would assume that Picasso, though he knew the gang, he met them when he met Rita, he wouldn't have had a huge interest, I expect. But this reminds us that Rita did come from this context of Montreal painting, the avant-garde in Montreal, that it was very important to her. She tried to go back and live in Quebec one year. It didn't work very well. But she maintained contact with the group. François Sullivan came to visit her a couple of years back when she had her show. So just to talk a little bit about that context of Rita, it's quite well known that she came from a family that was not full of artists, that she was able to go to study art in the Beaux-Arts because she was working as a waitress and drawing things, and one of the patrons of the restaurant was interested in her work and said he would support her for a year at the Beaux-Arts. She went to the Beaux-Arts, and there she heard about this gang of young people who were called the Automatiste group. She became a good friend of Jean-Paul Rousseau, and that was the big impact on her early work. You can see some of the works from that period of the small works on paper along the wall. And she worked her way through. She became very interested in this group and the work that they were doing, and she kind of took it upon herself, turned that into her own work. In fact, I'm going to talk a little bit about the exhibition in Spoleto, which was a major turning point in her life. And Charles Deloy, the man who wrote the text for the catalog, says that Rita, in a matter of months, was able to absorb everything the Automatiste painters learned over a matter of years, and then proceeded to make it her own. And I think there's some real justice in that statement. She gained a reputation very quickly, remarkably quickly. She was a quick study, it's obvious. So that having begun studying in 1948, which was the year that the Automatiste Manifesto, the Refus Global, was published, within a few years, she had taken on the energy of this group. She also did work influenced by the plasticiens, and again, that influence will be seen along that wall. But one of her kind of signal qualities was the energy that Barry is talking about. And it shows particularly in, you know, a piece like this. Now, if you imagine that about 5 or 6 times as large, with the deep impasto, with the strength. She often had kind of dark colors with brighter colors exploding through it. This was in her early work in the very early 60s. So you know, she came to the attention of various people. She had a show in the Dorothy Cameron Gallery in Toronto in 1960. I wrote all about this. You can just read it in here, but I forget from one minute to the next. So in the 50s, she was catching up. In the 60s, she was pretty well established. In 1962, because of the strength of works like this, she got a Canada Council grant to go and study in Europe. And that just happened to be the moment where the first major exhibition of Canadian art by Canadian read, mainly Québécois, by Canadian art in Europe happened in Spoleto, 1963, 62. And this was hugely important for Rita because somewhere here I've got the catalog. This is the catalog for the Spoleto exhibition. And, you know, just to give you some of the names, you know, starts with Pelon, Bordura, Riopel, Mousseau, Barbeau, Leduc, Gauvreau, Ferron, Bellefleur, the whole gang is there, right? Ulysse Comtois, Rita Letendre, a very good essay on Rita Letendre, a very appreciative essay, essentially about her energy, that same energy that Barry talks about. So she, have a look at it if you'd like. She got to know that gang, she developed in that gang. Guy Viau, who was with what had become the Automatiste group from the very, very beginning and kept contact right up to the end of his life. He published their works, he wrote about them. He was a huge cultural force in Quebec. And he has written one of the finest statements about Rita that I know of. He says, my translation, for Rita Letendre, painting is the perfect depiction of liberty. No doubt this ferocious taste for liberty comes from her Indian roots. The anguish she feels while working, the anguish any artist feels, may also depend on the fact that in her childhood, on her way home from school, her fellow students called her a sauvagesse and threw stones at her. Rita Letendre's painting is fiery, but it's just as carefully thought out as it is passionate. Her hand is as quick as her thinking is deliberate. She laughs when she says that her most important artistic tool is the chair she sits on. And by the way, when I eventually got to know her well and went into her studio, there it was. The chair that she'd sit on and just look at the work that she's done. She says that her most important artistic tool is the chair she sits on, endlessly interrogating her paintings. These paintings have the freshness of things just beginning, of the morning, suggesting natural disasters and the fusion of planets. Entirely a woman, Rita Letendre incarnates power. And I think that showed in her painting, and it, as Barry says, showed in her personality as well. One of the things that happened in Spoleto was that she met Cosso. So she and Ulysse traveled around for a couple of years after that, and as I remember it, actually spent time with Cosso in Israel. Did she talk about that?
Yeah.
And so, very soon, she dumped Ulysse for Cosso, and they ended up in California, where a totally different environment, and particularly a request to work on a mural, began the gradual change to this hard edge style. I would argue that the same energy, the same notion of light pushing its way through darkness is in these, as in these. But it was really an absolute major change, both artistically and economically. That's when they started to be known. Their works were being sold all over. They had places to work, studios in California, Toronto, and New York, and maybe elsewhere, I don't know. But they suddenly became a kind of international force. So as I understand it, by the time they came to Toronto, they were pretty well established, and they would have had the ability not to stay in Toronto if they wanted to, right? So it's kind of fortunate that they did take up Barry's offer and stick around, because of course we had some magnificent public artworks as a result of that. Big sunbursts on the side of buildings and subways, you know, with roofs that were full of color. So they had a huge impact on this city. When I came to Toronto in '72 to York University, they owned the town. As far as I was concerned, you saw their work all over the place. As I say, on the sides of building, Cosso's work in front of banks was really quite an astonishing development. And then if you look around the show, and it's not an enormous show, but you really get a good sense looking at these works of the parcours, of the journey that she traveled on, you know, the changes in her techniques over a period of time. So I think that's all I need to say.
For the moment. You know, it's, I suppose I can add a couple more things in the context of what Ray said. So how I started was to, I guess, make clear that when they came here, they certainly had a sense of themselves, and they were known in certain circles internationally. But they did not feel at home when they first came here, and they didn't know how to make themselves at home. And I use that phrase advisedly because for two people who were so independent and shared this force for independence, they really wanted a place to be at home. And in a way, they achieved it here in Toronto, particularly when they lived on Sherbourne Street. Because this is not, Claire could have talked about this, I can't really, but Rita was able to have a garden there. She loved to garden.
Well, there are films, there's videos available of that piece. By Cosso's son, is it a film?
Oh yeah, the sun,
Yeah, there's a wonderful video that depicts them in that environment. It was a
Yeah,
wonderful
yeah,
house.
she loved gardening, and Claire loved gardening, so that's one thing they could really talk about with deep feeling and affection for life and the world, because she had a lovely garden behind that house on Sherburne Street. But anyway, this business of home. It would be it is understandable if I put Kosso's yearning this way. He was born in Russia, but he thought of himself as Israeli, and in 1969, I think it was, he and Rita went to Israel, and it so happened that and now I had known them maybe for 2 years. And I went to Israel myself because I was going to make a film there about Israel. And they established themselves in Tel Aviv. They had an apartment, and she had a different chair, but she was at work. And it became kind of sad, I guess, for Kosso. I can put it this way and tell you a little story, I guess. Kosso, for my needs and out of his own amusement, was introducing me to all kinds of people in Israel. He seemed to know, well, he did know a lot of people. Kosso's work is in Israel. In Yad Vashem, he has a very central piece in Yad Vashem. Around the flame, as a matter of fact. And so you can understand that Kosso would have loved to have had a place for the two of them in Israel. He would have loved to have brought Rita home to where he thought of home. At the same time, he was establishing a home in Toronto. I don't want to belabor the tension, but it was there, and the yearning was there, and it didn't work. It didn't work. The Israelis simply did not know what to make of Rita. And I can sum it up this way. We went to supper one night in the home of an important Israeli novelist. His real name was Yizar Smilansky, and he wrote under the name of S. Yizar, Y-I-Z-A-R, and he wrote the novel that came to be known, I guess, as the novel for the 48, as they would speak of it then, the 48 generation. It was called The Days of Ziklag. An interesting novel. Just as a sidebar, one of the most interesting things about Israel for me, which contained its own tensions, as I talked to these writers while I was there, is that of course the Israelis were every day creating a new language. I mean, the Hebrew had been the language of religious folk. And there's no Hebrew word, or no ancient Hebrew word for tractor, obviously, let alone greb boots. And so the language, these writers, this guy Yizar Smilansky's favorite writer was Faulkner. So you can imagine a guy whose sensibility was Faulknerian, who wanted to write in a language which was being created every day. There was a kind of craziness about all of this, but wonderful. They have created the language. One of my closest friends became Yehuda Amichai, the really great poet. Smilansky was a minor writer in the fullness of time, but Amichai is a great poet. And he wrote poetry in this created language. It's extraordinary. So here's what happened though with Smilansky. Smilansky at this supper in his house, he took me aside and said with this kind of guileless wonder, "Is she really Aboriginal?" And I said to him, what do you mean by Aboriginal?" And he went and got him. I don't want to take this in the context of what's going on and loaded in any way. This is just what happened. He went to his bookshelf and he took down a book which was about Australia. And he opened it up and he said to me, he said, they Aboriginal, pointing at the Aboriginals, and then I have to tell you this, he said, like the Palestinians. At which point, Picasso, I could see the blood just drain out of Picasso's face. This is not what he wanted me to hear from anybody. But it passed as a moment. But I just tell you that because this is the world, and Rita found herself there. They didn't know what the hell to make of her. And she didn't know what to make of them. And they stayed, I don't know, you could work it out, those who do that kind of stuff, maybe 8 months, something like that. I don't know, wasn't long anyway. And they came back to Toronto, and Toronto became their home. But back, as anybody would understand, Picasso would have loved to have been able to go back and be in Israel. It's too obvious, I don't have to belabor the point. But I don't know that he ever went back to Israel. I really don't know. And I wouldn't have paid attention to that. But he settled into his home on Sherbrooke. Now, the thing about them settling into their home and being everywhere in the culture, my sense of them is that they were everywhere in the culture, but the culture at its core was not everywhere with them. If that makes any kind of sense. I don't think Picasso ever felt totally at home. And Rita, I would say, didn't need the culture around her to feel at home. She was her own, I would put it that she was her own culture. She was her own territory. She never went back to Quebec. She never engaged through the years that I knew her. I didn't know her that well in the last 20 years of her life. But she never engaged her indigenous roots except to tell stories about how she fought her way out, the light coming out of the darkness. She was always fighting for the light. And the light, she believed, was within herself. She was, in some ways, the most sustaining person I know, or have ever known, except that she was, given those terms, extremely vulnerable in terms of how she saw herself. And I can put that in personal terms, and then we can go back to whatever Ray wants to call it. My relationship with Picasso was very intense. That is, I had found a guy in Toronto who could talk about anything that I wanted to talk about in the international world. I could talk to him about Russian poetry, I could talk to him about Russian history, all those things. So I used to be there maybe 4 times a week. Crazy as it sounds, but and particularly when I left my wife, I actually fell in love with an Israeli girl. And that was the end of my marriage. And so I spent a lot of time as a separated person with them. And then suddenly one day, Rita just laid the law down with me standing there. She said, he has to stop coming around here so much. He's taking up my time. And I was in her, this Picasso and I he would sit there at his work desk. He would sit there for hours, moving these styrofoam things around. Used to amuse me enormously, watching him finding new ways of balancing the same old styrofoam sticks, right? And eating nuts. The guy ate more nuts than anybody I've ever seen in my life. And we would talk about everything. And it just came to an end. This was the period when he was doing, which I think is his greatest piece, which is down in Kingston. That piece is marvelous, the sculpture by the lake down there. He phoned me up one day and said, I'm going to give final approval to the piece in Kingston. You want to come with me? And I said, well, how are we going to do that? And he said, well, that way we can have a talk like we used to talk, we can take the bus. We took the bus from Toronto to Kingston so we could have a chat, without really getting pissed off. Right? So she was a force in every way, but she was a force unto herself, with the exception, without Casso, she was lost. Casso, without Rita, was lost. Those two were just beautifully structured for each other. And they fed off each other, they adored each other, they brought the best, whatever their talents were, they brought the best out in each other. It was an extraordinary thing to be in the presence of the two of them when they were in full tilt. Well, all such things have to come to an end, and they came to an end. But I remember those days, boys, of fantastic intellectual, emotional energy, great love, I have to say, between us. But she had her own territorial world, and Casso yielded to it.
You know, she didn't go back to Quebec until after Casso had died.
Right, I'm not surprised.
So that suggests to me that in effect she didn't go back to Quebec because Casso wouldn't have fitted in there.
No, he wouldn't have.
And so,
Well, it's also where Ulysses Comtois was.
sorry?
The other man was, in her life, was there, Ulysses.
Yeah, yeah, but I doubt if he would have been any problem for Casso.
No, it would have been a problem, I think, in her head.
I think that she wanted to, when she eventually went back to live with her son Jacques, and as I understand it, it had to do with Jacques suggesting that she might be better off there. She didn't go into the center of the city of Montreal. She stayed out in Longueuil, and she was lonely essentially because there was none of the old gang there, right? So she, this is hearsay, this is gossip that I've heard from it. So, but my sense is that the reason that she had little contact with Quebec, even though she had close friends there, was that it was difficult with Casso. So we're talking about the difficulty of fitting into two different environments.
When she went back to the Montreal, where she was living, Eastern Township, so isolated.
Yeah.
Many times the feel I live in here in Toronto. I love the city. I like city living. I don't like to live in the country. That's why when I went back to the Montreal, those people didn't mean anything for me anymore.
Yes.
Because I lost my connection with all the friends and everything. That's why
She went
I come back to live in Toronto again.
Yes.
I love the Toronto because
She went-
all her friends in here.
She went back to Montreal because she felt there was family there. But she also said, family doesn't necessarily mean blood. And she realized that she had a very strong family in Toronto. And that's what drew her
That's
back.
good.
Yeah. It makes absolute sense. Absolute sense.
Barry, I would like to know the first interview you did for the Rita. In the CBC, you asked for why are you painting contemporary abstract, you don't paint something else. Then, she just little smile and then said, well, it doesn't,
She said,
they don't tell me that this is gonna be art.
yeah, she said, I wouldn't be an artist.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
which, I'm not trying to pick a fight, but I think it, frankly, does a disservice to her to try and incorporate her into the current conversation about Indigenous painting and art as it is conducted. That's why I emphasize, she was a force unto herself, a self-sustaining force as much as she could be, as much as those around her could bear. Because sometimes it became overbearing. That's why I tell you the story about her telling me I could only come to the house twice. It was her territory. The other thing I would throw in, I don't pretend that I'm telling you any final truths about her at all. This is all speculative on my part. But the other thing to throw into the mix, if you will, about her temperament and sense, is she loved opera. So what does that tell you? I mean, not every painter in town loves opera, right? As a matter of fact, she's the only painter I know in this town, or I guess I know anywhere, well, Margaret Atwood loves opera. But I can't think of anybody else I know. So what was it in opera, depending on what you make of opera, that is related to that? You see? Because if she came into my territory, she would end up listening to Muddy Waters or somebody like that. And that would be alien to her. That would be strange to her. That was not, she would listen to it because I was playing it, but she never said listen. Cosso once or twice would say, you know, I remember playing Buddy Guy for him for the first time in my own apartment. But that was not a world she wanted to know anything about or to engage. That wasn't her musical world. Her musical world turned out to be opera, which must tell somebody something about her that we don't know. It can be, well, it's just there. So I don't know. She's a mystery. Why wouldn't she be a mystery? But the trouble with people who are mysteries is that other people, and I may be guilty of this myself, that they try to incorporate those mysteries into their own views of what life is and what life should be. So my attitude toward her is that you have to take her totally on her own terms, within the context of Cosso, and to try and build some other world around her that satisfies your own interests or my own interests. It can be very dangerous and misleading about who she was.
Maybe somebody in the audience knows something about her, things about her that we don't know, or has questions about what we've.
Because I'm just about talked out it theoretically.
Opera was really important to her because that's.
Sorry?
I say opera was really important to her because as a young person, this was her way of expanding her universe. She found opera on the CBC, and she was always worried about not having gone to school and not having had a huge education. But she wouldn't read fiction. I mean, she only read scientific poems. She was a better nutritionist than her doctor. I mean, she had so many spheres and importance. And so I agree with you that, yes, it is the flavor of the month to describe her as an original painter, but that's not how she described herself, ever.
Yep.
What I found fascinating finding fascinating is the Toronto social ethos in the 1960s, which is qualitatively different from the Toronto now in terms of how they impacted or how they imparted. And it's a history that is receding, and I believe more should be made of this because Toronto in that time was a very dry, insular city, and I was not a minority, being a white Anglo-Saxon, well-educated Presbyterian. It was that how it was totally included. And so to me, what was interesting was opera and escape, because opera is passion, opera is dialectic and extreme in terms of music, regardless, and the colorization, and opera can dwell in terms of emotions because of the tonal quality, and I know very little about this artist, as many as you may know, but to me what is fascinating is what I call how Toronto is changing and what Toronto was when Greenwood was developing all those white buildings on Beloyal and Davisville, and now you go up and down Yonge Street, what's happening now?
Well, here, I was thinking about this last night, as a matter of fact. I forgot that I was thinking about it. I forget my name these days. When I explained to Cosso originally that this was a living room town. You know, it was all behind drapes, and so Saturday night behind the drapes. I meant to mention that the place had that the painting or artistic world had a kind of coherence to it. Very small, but coherent. So, and this was the world that they were coming into. And the territories were quite clearly defined and energetically engaged by the people who were buying art. In those days, one knew, as a young guy around town I knew, but all kinds of people like William Kilbourne and all kinds of, from various aspects of the city, largely either white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, a few Catholics thrown in, and I guess a good number of Jews because they were collectors and deeply engaged. I think of the Waxer family, for example, Percy Waxer and Jesse Waxer. And anyway, you could determine that world in terms of the galleries, right? Because you had the Isaacs Gallery on Yonge Street. Now, Av was a very interesting guy. Av must have had some kind of natural instinct and eye, because if you sat and talked, especially in the beginning days, if you sat and talked to Av about painting, you came away thinking that the guy doesn't know a goddamn thing about painting. He just somehow moved from being a framer into this guy who was in charge of all the local, or most of the local so-called cutting-edge artists. And then that's where the Artist Jazz Band played, for example, Robert Markle and Michael Snow on piano. And it was always the opening there and the opening at, what's her name, next door that was raided?
Dorothy Cameron. Dorothy Cameron.
Dorothy Cameron. And then there was a guy in the same place afterwards, next door.
Yeah, Cameron.
Then there was Lang on Bloor Street, who did Reappel, and the Roberts Gallery south of Bloor on Yonge Street, who did Jean-Paul Lemieux and a whole bunch of junk painters, who are now getting $12,000 and $20,000 to $50,000 on the auction. It's crazy, but we all knew where those galleries were, and there were two outsiders: William Ronald, who was a loose cannon, and Harold Town. And Harold Town was so determinedly estranged from this community that he had his own dealer who was at the top end of Yonge Street. I've forgotten her name, but just south of Hogs Hollow, for Christ's sake. And
I
so,
think you should actually mention Jack Pollock.
and Jack Pollock, I'm just going to say, and Jack Pollock was unmarked.
First of all, gay, and secondly, a great protagonist for an Indigenous artist who becomes quite
So
important.
the
So
point is,
I think the other thing you have to know, I grew up in Toronto at that time, I was the art
Yeah.
critic for the Toronto Star.
So
we were
you knew-
development, but I'd like to say, you have to mention anti-Semitism and racism if you talk about
if we
Toronto at that
can
time.
come back to that if you
Well,
want.
I'm sorry, I'm just mentioning it, you
No,
invited us to
no,
participate,
I'm just talking
mentioning it.
to answer his question.
Sorry.
We all knew where the action was. And not only did we know where the action was, openings were events. So if you went to the Isaacs Gallery, there'd be 100 people at the Isaacs Gallery on a Thursday night to open for, say, the Dennis Burton's Garter Belt series. I think of that, I'll tell you why I think about that and what kind of town this was. Dennis Burton had his Garter Belt series open at the Isaacs Gallery. Most of the paintings, let's take a guess and say there would have been 12 paintings in the front gallery. He would have sold maybe 9, something like that. The next show that Av had, I walked in, I was then in graduate school. I walked in to see it. It was engravings and woodcuts and stuff by Rembrandt and Dürer. So I walked around, I looked at this, and came back to Ev, I said, am I reading this correctly? Is that the four horsemen of the apocalypse from 1490? He said, yes, that's the real deal. And I looked, I said, you haven't got one red star on the wall here. What's going on? And he said, I don't know. I was just offered this to say that it's all for sale. I bought it. You know what I paid for it? $300. $300. People were paying $4,000 back then for Dennis Spurgeon's garter belts. It tells you something about the town back then. That, you know, they were buying this stuff at the Roberts Gallery, but they were also buying Ab and they were buying Harold Town. There was big action. And I mentioned the waxers. Waxers would have big social evenings. A lot of people would show up at their house for those social evenings. They wanted to be in touch with the painters, they wanted to be in touch with the dealers, and they wanted to be in touch with writers. There was something wonderful about that. Everybody knew what was going on. So to answer your question, I have no sense at all that this is true right now. I know that they tried out around the junction to create around cuts and, you know, several galleries out there. It hasn't worked, not in that way. I don't know why. I don't know what. This was part of the city being very provincial, which is why Casso and Rita had socially a kind of difficult time. They just weren't socially of the temper. You know, if you can imagine Casso and Rita meeting Michael Snow, nothing could be said between those people. Michael Snow played a passable piano, but that was his social gesture. Other than that, in my experience. So it was a very particular world. I wish people who knew a lot about it would write about it. I wish that, to me, that's true about most of Toronto history, particularly in the 60s. It was very interesting, very special, and I don't see that any of it has survived at all in the current world. But then I'm not, you know, I'm an old guy wandering around, wondering what's going on the few times I wander around anymore. So.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you very much. Nice to have you here.